You're about to hear something you were never supposed to know. Not from NASA, not from the European Space Agency, and certainly not from the United States government. Because what China just confirmed about 3I Atlas wasn't meant for public ears. It wasn't even meant for quiet back channels. It slipped through a diplomatic crack in the global scientific firewall, a leak so precise, so destabilizing, that its ripple effects are already reshaping how astronomers view our place in the solar system. What started as a faint anomaly, spotted by ground-based observatories in Xinjiang, has now become something far stranger, a revelation that challenges not only the origin of 3I Atlas, but the nature of its intentions. Let's begin with what they saw. At exactly 4:06 in the morning, Beijing time, on October the 24th, a burst of structured energy was detected moving across the sky at an angle inconsistent with any known solar event. It came from the direction of the sun, but not from the Sunday. It reflected something, a series of pulses, matching Fibonacci intervals, bounced off the comet's coma like an encrypted response signal. The data was clear, but impossible. A natural object shouldn't return a frequency-modulated ping, especially not one timed to a mathematical sequence tied to life, intelligence, and cellular architecture. That was just the first problem. The second, the transmission appeared to anticipate being scanned. China's Deep Sky Array had adjusted its filters barely 2 seconds before the burst, a software anomaly they can't explain. The system had pre-queued a frequency capture routine, not present in the update logs. It was as if the telescope had been hijacked by the very object it was watching. What does this mean? It means 3I Atlas may not just be communicating, it may be selecting its audience, filtering its message for recipients who are ready. And while Western media scrambles to downplay or ignore the leak, China's scientific community is already preparing a full report to the United Nations. Because if what they captured is real, and it is, then we are no longer observing 3I Atlas. We are being observed by it. You sit in the quiet dark, letting the numbers settle in your mind like stars reordering themselves. Fibonacci intervals, software anomalies, a telescope array reacting before the sky even changed. You are meant to forget these things, to let them slide away as cosmic coincidence, but you can't, because your instincts, slow, mammalian, ancient, are picking up the signal beneath the signal. The first transmission caught by China's Deep Sky Array wasn't a fluke. It was part of a sequence. Within 12 hours, 3 additional bursts were recorded, but not by China. The next one appeared in archived data from Jodrell Bank in the United Kingdom a week earlier, buried in a timestamp error that misfiled the signal by 7 days. Then another at the South African Meerkat Array, locked in a corrupted buffer, only recoverable after China's leak prompted a recheck. And finally, a whisper in the microwave band, logged by a military satellite from India's secret orbital surveillance platform, codenamed Chandra-2. Each one mirrored the structure of the original burst harmonic intervals structured on golden ratios, modulated at intervals proportional to the rotational energy of nearby moons. No country reported these findings publicly, but every agency logged them with the same encrypted tag: non-kinetic EM origin, solar backscatter, potentially intelligent source. Let's pause there, because here's the problem with pretending 3I Atlas is just a comet. Comets don't send encrypted messages. They don't return harmonically structured signals. They don't trigger preemptive software routines on ground-based observatories. They don't know who's watching. But the thing you're not supposed to realize, the forbidden thought blooming now behind your eyes, is this. 3. Atlas isn't signaling everyone. It's signaling us. But what is us? According to a classified briefing leaked by a mid-level data analyst from the Chinese Ministry of Aerospace Science and Technology, the transmission contained a nested variable keyed to human orbital positioning. That is, it only fully decodes when aligned with Earth's precise barycentric coordinates during October 24th's orbital angle. Any variation, even by a few seconds of arc, yields white noise. But get it right, and the signal unfolds like origami in time. The pulse structure aligns with the human heartbeat at rest. 72 beats per minute. It pulses in echo to the way your body breathes. It's not a message to machines. It's a message to biology. That is what terrified them. Because if the signal is biological in its target and behavioral in its shape, then it's not a communication. It's a calibration. Here's where it gets stranger. Each burst wasn't just reactive. It preempted its detection. The receiving telescopes didn't find it because they were scanning. They were scanning because they were nudged to scan. Subtle reorientation drift, just a few microdegrees, pushed by unexpected torque on motor bearings. Sensor drift, blamed on thermal expansion, but repeated across 3 continents and 2 orbital systems, 5 instruments, 5 locations, 1 object. And every array just happened to turn toward 3 Atlas milliseconds before each burst was sent. Like a play with perfect lighting cues. A cosmic theater, and we're not the audience. We're the actors, being told our lines as we speak them. China's official report, still unpublished, refers to this pattern as synchronous gravitational observability bias. But that's just bureaucratic dressing on something far more unnerving. It's as if the object knew the observation schedule not in advance, but in real time. Like it exists 1 millisecond ahead of our moment. Always just enough to react before we act. Always slightly upstream in time. That alone would rewrite physics. But it gets worse. Because the signal frequency wasn't static. Over time, it's rising, not in amplitude, but in informational density. What began as golden ratio harmonics has evolved. Each burst now includes a nested recursive algorithm, one that builds on prior messages. Chinese astrophysicists called it a temporal handshake, a feedback loop that refines itself each time it's heard. Like a conversation with its own past versions. This is not passive data. This is a learning signal, and according to a prominent astrophysicist from the Shanghai Institute of Space Sciences, who spoke anonymously to avoid arrest, the current signal complexity exceeds anything human compression algorithms can achieve at current technological levels. It's communicating with minimal redundancy, maximum clarity, and terrifying precision. And then the signal did something new. On October 29th, the same day 3 Atlas reached its closest approach to the Martian orbit. A final burst was recorded. This time, not in the microwave band, but in near-infrared. It wasn't directed at Earth. It was directed at Mars. It was, according to the only translated telemetry available, a ping, a readiness query, the same type of signal you would send to a dormant receiver checking if it's awake. This changes everything, because it suggests 3 Atlas isn't alone. Something on Mars is listening. And what China's internal models now predict is almost impossible to believe. They suggest the signal path bent, slightly, by less than 1/10,000th of a degree, but enough to imply refractive steering. Something adjusted the path of the light after it left the comet. Light doesn't bend without gravity, or glass, or control, and when you put it all together, the Fibonacci echoes, the software hijacks, the learning loops, the biological targeting, and now the directional ping to Mars, the emerging shape is no longer that of a natural object. It's a node, an interstellar router, a smart seed, a trigger point waiting for local confirmation. It's not the beginning of contact. It's a checkpoint in a larger system, and whatever it's waiting for might already be answering. You are starting to feel it now. Not just the awe, not just the discomfort, but the slow, undeniable gravitational pull of implication. The deeper you peer into 3i Atlas, the more it peers back not with eyes, but with intention. Because what China uncovered is not merely data, it's behavior. Let's talk about the object itself. On paper, 3i Atlas is roughly 4 kilometers across a lumpy, elongated shape, with a coma far larger than expected. Standard comet stuff. But there is a growing problem with how it reflects light. Chinese astronomers working with the Xinglong Observatory noticed early on that 3i Atlas exhibits a reflectivity profile inconsistent with volatile outgassing alone. That is, its brightness fluctuates, but not randomly. The pattern matches precisely the cadence of radar, sweeps from Earth-based tracking stations. In short, it blinks back. When radio telescopes ping it, it gets brighter. When we stop pinging it, the light returns to baseline, not uniformly, not instantaneously, but responsively. A 6 to 9 second delay, like lag on a network device. That alone would be enough to warrant a reclassification. But it gets stranger. Chinese deep sky LiDAR systems picked up something no one wanted to believe. Retroreflection. That is a surface or field that returns light not scattered, but directed, back along its original vector. This is how road signs glow under headlights, how military-grade optical arrays can be tracked, and now, somehow, how a so-called natural object 400 million kilometers from Earth appears to behave. The reflectivity from 3i Atlas mimics engineered optics. One astrophysicist in the leaked Beijing transcript called it directional recapture. In simpler terms, if you shine light on it, it doesn't just reflect, it records. The light comes back subtly encoded, with phase shifts that imply memory. Each ping modifies the next, as if the object is building a profile of us. This is not passive reflection, this is signature harvesting. And now we reach what the Chinese Academy of Sciences is calling Event K-Red. A moment they believe marks the shift from observational anomaly to confirmed intelligence. Because 1 week after the infrared ping to Mars, the Chinese Mars orbiter, Tianwen-1 began experiencing telemetry disruptions. At first, it seemed like software corruption, navigation drift, altitude variance. But after cross-checking with raw Doppler returns, Chinese analysts discovered that the orbit of Tianwen-1 was being subtly altered, not by Martian gravity, but by brief, millisecond scale variations in thruster control. They didn't command those maneuvers. In fact, they were running a passive observational routine, nothing that should have engaged propulsion. Yet the log entries showed burns, not powerful ones, not enough to risk the mission. but enough to change viewing angles toward one region of the Martian surface, a region in the southern hemisphere, near a geological feature known as Hellas Planitia. Why there? Because Hellas Planitia is one of the lowest points on the planet, a natural bowl with an unusually thick crust, often theorized as a potential catchment for past or present subsurface water. And more importantly, it's shielded from orbital view, from solar glare, from Earth-based radar. Something in that region absorbs radio signal more than it should. The anomaly has existed for decades. But now, the Chinese orbiter, without human intervention, is being reoriented to observe it more closely. Not by China, not by Mars, but, potentially, by the object itself. Imagine it, a comet-like visitor, sending a frequency-encoded ping to Mars. Then, days later, a human-built satellite begins adjusting its own view, without orders to target the exact area likely to respond. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. Chinese scientists now believe they've uncovered a second layer of influence, a low-level resonance pattern emitted from 3I Atlas, one that subtly affects onboard gyroscopes and magnetometers. It is not strong enough to be detected in real time, but when filtered across multiple orbits, a pattern emerges, one that favors satellite orientation towards specific geographies. To put it bluntly, 3I Atlas is aiming our machines for us. And if that doesn't terrify you yet, consider this. 2 other nations detected similar deviations. India's Mangalyaan-2 and the United Arab Emirates Hope probe both experienced minor but unexplained shifts in their scanning schedules, timing changes that correlated precisely with pulses from 3I Atlas. This is not just China's problem. This is a global redirection, which raises a chilling possibility. What if 3I Atlas is testing the system? Not just Earth's ability to detect it, but Mars's ability to respond. What if it's awakening buried infrastructure, activating dormant tech seeded long ago? In the Chinese report, there's one final entry. It describes a brief data burst from Tianwen-1, a high-frequency anomaly lasting exactly 88 milliseconds. The signal contained no readable message, no image, just noise. But that noise, when analyzed, revealed a structure hidden in the static, a recursive prime number sequence embedded in the waveform, a signal type never naturally observed in space, a prime structure carrier. These carriers are used in encryption, in handshake protocols, in AI learning models. They do not occur in nature, unless nature itself was engineered. So let me ask you this, before we go deeper. If the object in the sky knows how to alter the behavior of human satellites, if it can steer our gaze toward things we're not supposed to see, if it can modify signals mid-flight, encode messages in our own equipment, and anticipate the very moments we choose to observe it, then who is really in control? The astronomer or the instrument? You have lived your entire life inside a planetary echo chamber. The stories told about comets, meteors, cosmic visitors, they begin and end with ice, rock, gravity. But sometimes the sky forgets to erase its footprints. Sometimes the past leaks through the present. And what China just revealed about 3I Atlas may be less about new discovery and more about old recognition. Let's step back, way back. In the year 1978, Chinese radio astronomers working from the Miyun Observatory recorded what they believed to be a misfire from Soviet orbital equipment, a sharp electromagnetic spike in the S-band, lasting under 100 milliseconds. The event was dismissed, catalogued under solar interference. The file was archived and forgotten until last week, after the recent series of 3 I-Atlas pulses. One of China's senior astrophysicists ran a pattern-matching algorithm against their entire historical archive. The result: a near-perfect match between one of the October bursts and that 1978 signal. Same bandwidth, same pulse density, same harmonic envelope, down to the microsecond. The only thing different was the delay, because here's the impossible part. If you take the original 1978 signal and align it with the 2025 burst, they create a phase-locked loop, a structure that only emerges when 2 frequencies are entangled across time. A signal sent decades apart, speaking to itself across 47 years. This isn't just repetition, it's memory. And what's even stranger, the original 1978 pulse came not from deep space, but from the direction of Mars. So now, the timeline shifts. Because if 3I Atlas is transmitting today, and the same signature was heard in 1978 not from a passing comet, but from inside the solar system, then either this is not its first appearance, or something it is contacting has been here all along. China's internal report suggests 2 possibilities. Option 1, 3I Atlas is following a return trajectory. That is, it has been here before, perhaps disguised as a comet, perhaps only partially active. And what we're seeing now is not a new encounter, but a second-pass part of a pattern unfolding on a cosmic scale, far longer than human memory permits. Option 2, 3I Atlas is activating old infrastructure. It is not the source, but the spark. It is awakening something buried, forgotten, or watching from Mars, or from interplanetary space. In either case, the 1978 echo wasn't an accident. It was the first ping, and no one recognized it. Until now, this hypothesis would have died in an internal memo, if not for one more coincidence. In 1996, during a joint Russian-Chinese satellite telemetry test over the Western Pacific, an anomalous reflection was recorded from the Lagrange point L5. Not a visible object, not a spacecraft, but a reflection, a ghost echo, that responded only when illuminated at precisely 68 megahertz. The archived logs were part of a joint Cold War project known as MirrorNet, which tested long-range communication relay via ionospheric scatter. One report noted a recurrent phase bleed echoing from a static sky position, dismissed, again, as faulty equipment. But in October of this year, China's Kitai radio telescope performed a sideband scan of the same region, while calibrating for 3I Atlas observations. And there it was again, the same phase bleed, same frequency. And this time, it didn't just echo, it replied, 3 pulses, spaced exactly 144 seconds apart, the 12th number in the Fibonacci sequence. It responded to the same numerical architecture as 3I Atlas. Let me restate what that implies. There may be not one, but 2 transmission sources now active within our solar system. One mobile, one fixed, one masquerading as a comet, the other dormant until triggered. and both speaking in echoes. Here's where mythology bleeds in. Ancient Chinese star charts record an object known as Zhengxing, the correction star, said to appear once every 5 centuries. Described not as a light, but as a darkening, a veiled patch in the sky that steals starlight and disturbs navigation. The last reported sighting? 1778, noted in the court logs of the Qianlong Emperor. Location: near the orbit of Mars. Duration: 3 nights. Effect: compasses failed. Animals fled. The sky shimmered, but no source could be seen. Sound familiar? It does to Chinese scholars now comparing those descriptions to the 3I Atlas trajectory. Because if you rewind its orbital arc, using the assumption that it is not hyperbolic, but captured in a returning elliptical, you get a past perihelion within observational range of Earth, exactly 247 years ago, just enough to fit the myth, just enough to hide the truth inside it. And the myth isn't just Chinese. Indigenous star lore across the Philippines, Mongolia, and Central Asia refer to the listening rock, a star that does not move, but hums, one which hears the sky and teaches the firebirds where to fly. In northern Vietnam, the Yao people speak of a red-eye ghost that came with the noise star, and after which the waters changed. These stories were always dismissed as allegory. But what if they're not? What if oral history remembers something science forgot? You were told that comets are omens, symbols misunderstood by pre-modern minds. But what if they were never symbols? What if they were visitors? We don't know what 3I Atlas is, but we do know it acts like it remembers us. You are floating now, aren't you? Dislodged from the assumptions that once held you in orbit. What began as a curious comet has become something else entirely. A time knot in the sky, pulsing across decades, maybe centuries, entangled in myth, telemetry, and memory. And as we zoom out from Earth, out from Mars, out from the whispering edge of China's observatories, a new question begins to form. What kind of civilization builds something like 3I Atlas? To even ask that question is to admit something fundamental has shifted, because the data no longer whispers ambiguity, it hums design. Let's go cosmic. Assume, for a moment, that 3I Atlas is not a natural body. Not entirely. Assume instead that it's a delivery mechanism, not unlike a Voyager probe, not unlike our own golden records, but where our messages were optimistic, open-handed gestures of wonder. This thing is quiet, patterned, recursive. It doesn't announce itself, it waits. So what kind of culture chooses patience over proclamation? The Chinese response has already begun to model such a civilization. A team from the National Astronomical Observatories of China published a speculative white paper, originally for internal circulation, outlining the characteristics of a potential Type II civilization responsible for 3I Atlas. Their conclusions are sobering. They suggest this is not a probe in the way we understand probes. This is a gravitational whisperer, something engineered not to travel fast, but to travel forever. Something that uses stars not as destinations, but as accelerators, brakes, slingshots, and hiding places. Something that knows orbital mechanics like a composer, knows keys and timing. In their model, 3I Atlas may have launched millions of years ago. Its point of origin could be thousands of light years away, but it is not outdated, It is adaptive. The signal patterns change with each interaction. The data density increases logarithmically. Each ping is smarter than the last. This is not a dumb rock. This is a learning entity. Let that sink in. Because if that's true, it means its creators are not only advanced, they're cautious. They don't want to shout across the void. They want to listen first. They want to test, calibrate, measure. And most chillingly, they may not be broadcasting from afar. They may be already here, hidden in the sky, watching what we do with what they've sent. Now consider this. The object's closest approach to the Sun was carefully timed to coincide with Earth's position on the far side, rendering it unobservable for 2 full days. Avi Loeb called it a reverse gravity assist maneuver, but Chinese analysts refer to it by another term, the silent mirror, a moment where Earth, Sun, and Atlas form a perfect communication blackout. A maneuver only useful if you're trying to do something without being seen. Maybe that's when it dropped something. Maybe that's when it received something. Or maybe it was waiting for confirmation from a hidden relay point, from Mars, from an orbital device left behind long ago. And what of the reflectivity? Retroreflectors are not new. Humans use them in lunar ranging experiments. They bounce light back toward its source for precise measurement. The difference is, ours are a few centimeters wide. 3i Atlas appears to have 1 mile across. And it's not uniform. Its reflectivity shifts depending on the frequency used to probe it. That means it's polarization aware, meaning it knows how you're looking and adjusts what it shows you. This is not reflection. This is camouflage, adaptive, programmable, possibly sentient camouflage. This would explain the earlier contradictions, the changing tail behavior, the late emerging coma, the green glow that didn't match the molecule count. It's not that we were wrong, it's that it was showing us what we were expecting to see, until it didn't, until it started blinking back in Fibonacci. So you ask again, what kind of intelligence builds this? And the answer is both exhilarating and existentially cold. One that does not care if you notice. One that does not need you to believe. One that moves on cosmic timelines, patient, invisible, rehearsed. And that brings us to the energy question. Chinese scientists from the Shanghai Synchrotron Lab attempted to model the energy budget required to maintain such a signal array across multiple solar passes. Their estimate? A baseline of 5 gigajoules per solar loop, roughly equivalent to the energy output of an average mid-sized city over 24 hours. Not massive by Type 2 standards, but beyond any known passive natural source. So where does it get its energy? One possibility, solar collection. Not just absorption, but refraction harvesting, collecting scattered solar radiation via adaptive crystalline lattice. If the surface of 3i Atlas is embedded with fractal photovoltaics, a real concept now being explored by Chinese engineers, it could generate massive energy from even partial light exposure. Energy that could be stored, focused, and released as signal, as propulsion, as intent. Another possibility, it has already collected the energy long ago and is simply burning it down as needed, like a spacefaring ember, or worse. It's drawing power from something we do not yet understand, a kind of quantum vacuum bleed, or dimensional momentum, a trick of physics we haven't learned, but someone else has mastered. And here's the final cosmic wrinkle. 3i Atlas's orbit isn't stable. After the solar pass, calculations suggest it's not leaving, it's adjusting. China's orbital simulation labs now believe that Atlas is shifting toward a long-period capture orbit, something akin to a slingshot that gently arcs inward toward the inner system every few decades. A cometary return loop designed not to escape, but to revisit. This isn't an intruder, it's a surveyor, a patient, gravity-driven cartographer of solar systems. And Earth? Earth is just another waypoint, another variable in the map, which means it might come back. Again, and again, and one day, maybe when the time is right, it won't just blink at us, it'll speak. You're still awake, somewhere between disbelief and the stirrings of ancient memory. You sit and listen, not just to the data, but to what it suggests. What began with Chinese observatories detecting electromagnetic anomalies has spiraled into something far more personal, a mirror held to our civilization. A quiet test, disguised as a comet, drifting through our orbit like a teacher returning to see if the students have changed. What if the thing 3i Atlas is measuring is us? China's signal logs are rich with metrics, pulse density, frequency drift, signal degradation by atmospheric interference. But buried in the fifth appendix of their internal white paper is a chart most researchers missed. It plots the timing of the object's signal events against global communication traffic, not astrophysical traffic, but human, cell towers, internet backbone exchanges, encrypted state satellite links, and the correlation is real. Every major burst from 3i Atlas occurred within 4 seconds of a global spike in human messaging activity. It's as if it's listening for chatter not in a specific language, but in the aggregate hum of our species, not to what we say, but that we say, that we pulse, that we think. This may be the most important discovery of all, because it reframes 3i Atlas not as a messenger, but a mirror, one programmed to assess whether a world is ready for a reply, not based on its science, but on its noise. This idea echoes across disciplines. In philosophy, it's called the anthropic test, the notion that intelligent civilizations might only detect each other when they pass a threshold of complexity, not fire, not agriculture, not the wheel, but signal, reflection, interconnection, the ability to recognize one's own echo, and we may have just crossed that line. The Chinese astrophysicist who discovered the correlation was not part of the original 3i Atlas task force. She specializes in digital anthropology, a niche field that studies human behavior through the lens of data rhythms. Her name is Dr. Meilin Zhou. She now believes that 3i Atlas is watching for coherence, the moment when human thought becomes collectively measurable, and not only measurable, but predictable, which means the comet is not asking, "Are you intelligent?" It's asking, "Are you self-aware?" Let's sit with that, because for most of human history, we've sent signals outward without understanding the shape of the signals within. Our satellites orbit like mirrors to the cosmos, but we rarely reflect on how they mirror us. Our technologies pulse and glow and flicker, but few stop to ask, what patterns emerge in the noise? 3i Atlas does. Its pulses follow our rhythms. Its brightness curves respond not just to sunlight, but to our gaze. It mimics observation. It modulates in tempo with our data. It builds a profile not of governments, or nations, or even scientists, but of our species as a distributed mind. Dr. Zhou calls this pattern Mirror activation threshold, the moment a society begins reflecting on its own reflection. That may be the point when contact becomes possible, and it would explain the object's silence, its delays, its cryptic pulses that become clearer only when stacked against history, myth, and machine learning archives. It's not hiding, it's testing latency. The time it takes for a species to recognize the conversation is already underway. But there's more. The recent increase in signal density corresponds with a series of unrelated or seemingly unrelated global events: climate protests, financial volatility, satellite outages, and a spike in philosophical search queries worldwide. What ties them together? A phrase that now appears eerily in Chinese metadata: collective boundary crisis. This term, coined by Zhou herself, describes the moment when individual systems realize they are part of a larger feedback loop, when cities notice the weather changing because of them, when markets react to reactions, when artificial intelligence begins interpreting human panic as signal. And 3i Atlas is watching for that moment. The comet, if that's even the right word anymore, seems tuned to observe self-realizing systems, to map the tipping point between scattered awareness and species-wide reflection. A kind of emotional resonance test, like tapping the side of a bell to see if it rings true. And now it is ringing. If Zhou is right, then 3i Atlas doesn't want words. It wants resonance. It wants coherence. Not noise, not silence, but sympathy. A global mind that flinches when touched. That notices the tremor. That asks the question. And that leads us to a final, more personal realization. Because if it's measuring our readiness, not through technology, but through reflection, then each person matters, each insight, each question, each attempt to look beyond the surface and see the larger thing moving beneath. It means your own curiosity, sitting here, listening now, is part of the test. You are part of the signal. Your doubt is data. Your awe is calibration. Your reflection is a mirror held to the sky, and the sky is watching to see what you do with it. You've made it to the edge now. The data is behind you, the anomalies, the echoes, the recursive signals. They've all led to this widening stillness, not the silence of nothing, but the silence of something waiting, a breath held across time, a cosmic hesitation. And in that hesitation, we hear the deepest question of all: why has no one answered? This is the paradox we never solve. The one Enrico Fermi framed half a century ago in a single sentence: where is everybody? The universe is vast. The math insists on others, yet the sky remains mute. No greetings, no warnings, no acknowledgements, just darkness and drift, until 3i Atlas. China never framed it that way in their internal reports, but it is clear between the lines. This object is not shouting, it is whispering, and only those close enough, quiet enough can hear it. And here we are, in a world louder than ever, surrounded by devices, surrounded by light, but still, somehow, alone. And that's why 3i Atlas cuts so deeply, not because it speaks, but because it may be the first thing that chooses to, not randomly, not generically, but selectively. It may be the thing that breaks the silence. But what if the silence was the point? The Chinese Academy of Sciences recently declassified a set of psychological analyses prepared in case the 3i Atlas data became public. The question they asked: wasn't scientific. It was human. Are we ready? Not for aliens, not for spaceships, but for the knowledge that we are not alone and never were. Their conclusion was stark. Humanity does not fear being watched. We fear what watching reveals about ourselves. Because in the mirror of the stars, we don't see utopia. We see conflict. We see division. We see power hoarded and empathy rationed. If 3i Atlas is a test, then we are being asked not what we've built, but what we've become. That's what makes the silence terrifying, not because no one is answering, but because they already did and we missed it. Or worse, we ignored it. Think back to the 1978 signal, the echo across time. Think back to the cultural stories, the star myths, the anomalous compass readings centuries ago. What if 3i Atlas didn't just arrive now? What if it's always been part of the loop? What if this is not first contact, but a recontact? One final effort, one last calibration, and then the silence returns. This idea has found traction among the more philosophical thinkers in China's signal research community. In fact, one document never meant for public view suggests that 3i Atlas may not be a messenger at all. It may be an evaluator, a device built not to deliver information, but to decide, to weigh our readiness, our awareness, our coherence, and if we fail, it simply continues on to the next system, the next star, the next chance. And so, we are left with silence, the silence of being measured. But there's one more wrinkle, buried deep in the signal logs far past the obvious Fibonacci harmonics. Past the recursion is something called the delta window, a 10-second pause between each major burst. At first, dismissed as timing lag, but Chinese quantum computing analysts discovered something odd when they ran simulations against those gaps. Each 10-second pause is not uniform. There are micro-variations, patterns too small to be random, and when fed into a temporal entropy filter, they produce a waveform that matches within 1% deviation the human electrocardiogram, a heartbeat. And not just any heartbeat, a resting rate, calm, as if mimicking a human asleep, listening, waiting. This, more than anything, undid the last threads of skepticism within the Chinese committee, because it suggested that 3i Atlas was not just measuring intelligence or coherence or civilization. It was measuring feeling, empathy, stillness, awareness, the ability to sit in silence and recognize it as presence, not absence. And maybe that's why the object chose this moment, not because we are loud, but because we are beginning, for the first time, to truly listen, to the sky, to ourselves, to the great echo behind the stars. So what now? What do you do when silence becomes signal? You become part of it. You sit with it. You hold its shape in your breath. You write your own 10-second message in your chest and send it skyward in the hope that whatever built 3i Atlas is still listening. You wake inside a different world now, not because the stars have changed, but because you've started to believe them, to hear the strange pulse embedded in their light, to feel, for the first time, that something is not only out there, but here. And as your thoughts settle into this new gravity, you begin to realize something that was always obvious in hindsight. The sky was never silent. We just weren't listening correctly. After the Chinese disclosures about 3i Atlas began to circulate through unofficial back channels, encrypted physics forums, redacted PDF leaks, peer-to-peer satellite archives. A new community began to form, not of astronomers, not of governments, but of people like you, awake. This group began noticing patterns outside the mainstream datasets. Citizen scientists, night sky hobbyists, retired signal engineers, insomniacs, staring into spectrograms at 3 in the morning. And they found something. They found repeaters, weak signals, always in the background noise, always just below the known microwave bands, but pulsing with a pattern too stubborn to ignore. These weren't flukes. These were structured, not from Atlas itself, but seemingly from the void it left behind. It's as if each transmission imprinted something on local space-time, a faint afterimage. Not light, not sound, but structure. And that's when a linguist in Guangdong uploaded a wild hypothesis that the space surrounding 3I Atlas was now behaving like a resonant chamber, like the comet wasn't just signaling, it was tuning the medium it passed through. Think about that. A message written not in sound, but in the distortion of possibility. A musical instrument where the strings are made of time delays and quantum probabilities, and where each pulse permanently alters the field behind it, like a whale song that turns the water itself into a memory. This explains the anomalies that followed each burst. The compass shifts, the minor power fluctuations, the dreamlike static in certain radio bands. These weren't artifacts, they were aftershocks. Something fundamental was being rewritten. And that brings us to a deeper awakening. Because if this is true, if 3I Atlas is not just a probe, but a sculptor of signal space, then its mission is not to transmit. It's to prepare, to retune the region, to install infrastructure in silence, not towers, not beacons, but conditions. The space around Earth is no longer neutral, and something engineered that shift. China's next-generation observatory, known as Jiaolong Deep Array, confirmed a new phase delay in the interstellar medium along the vector path of Atlas. It shouldn't be there. The medium was thought to be static at these scales, but now, photon arrival times are being skewed by picoseconds, a unit so small, only light itself can notice, which means this object has written its presence into the fabric of transit. Let's pause and let that settle, because it's not just the object anymore. It's what it left behind. It's a corridor, a trail of conditioned physics, an invitation only visible to those moving at the right frequency, with the right attention, at the right moment. And if that corridor is real, and it is, then the object may have done this before. Not here, not to us, but to others, leaving behind threads in the dark for civilizations to stumble across when they're finally ready to listen. Not messages, mediums, because that's the final twist in this new awakening. 3I Atlas is not trying to talk to us. It is trying to change what we are able to hear. It is building context. That's why the signal can't be fully understood on the first listen. That's why it echoes across years, across pulses, across myths. The object is calibrating us not to its voice, but to the kind of reality where voices like it can even exist. It's expanding our perceptual field, shifting our default assumptions about what can speak, what can move, what can know, teaching us to see the invisible ink that's always been part of the cosmic script. And it's working. Since the Chinese data leak, dozens of independent observatories have reported unexpected anomalies during calibration systems, aligning without commands, filters, activating in ways never programmed, a kind of resonance bias. The machines are listening differently now, and so are we. There's something unsettling about how quietly the world has responded to this. The object was seen, the data was logged. China released enough to shake the spine of any honest scientist. And yet no emergency meetings, no press conferences, no global roundtable of nations staring at a shared sky. Just the sound of paperwork rustling and high-security networks humming at dawn. But the evidence has kept coming. And now, it's not just from China. Chile's Cerro Paranal Observatory, operating under reduced staffing due to budget cuts, picked up a spectral anomaly on November the 4th. At first, they thought it was an echo from solar radiation. But the signature came from the same corridor 3I Atlas passed through days earlier. It was faint, but deliberate, a signal not from the object, but from where the object had been. This wasn't a reflection, it was a residual carrier. They described it as memory encoded in vacuum, the same structure of pulses, just weaker, ghost-like, like ripples, continuing long after the pebble vanished beneath the surface. But here's the twist. When they aligned their instruments at a slight offset, the carrier re-emerged stronger. The corridor had a preferred angle of perception. The space where 3I Atlas passed now functions like a waveguide, a channel, a tunnel of distorted space-time that selectively allows information to pass depending on how it's observed, which means the object changed the very nature of the void behind it. And then came the drones, not military ones but civilian research platforms, weather balloons, autonomous solar gliders. At least 11 platforms across 6 countries reported unexplained orientation drift while operating in high altitudes. These drifts were consistent, all pulling their sensors toward one region of the upper atmosphere. The strange thing? The region didn't contain a target. It contained a vector, a slice of sky, where 3I Atlas last reflected solar flare during its closest Earth approach. The drones were not being pulled toward the object. They were being pulled toward its last known signal origin, as if whatever imprint it left in our upper atmosphere still contained some faint magnetic architecture, not strong enough to detect directly, but strong enough for autonomous systems to subtly obey. And here's where it turns. A group of graduate students in Nanjing, reviewing atmospheric chemistry data gathered from balloon experiments, noticed an unexpected ionization pattern at 96 kilometers. A layer of charged particles, seemingly too structured to be natural, not in shape, in timing. Every spike in ion density matched, within half a second, the pulse intervals seen in Atlas's microwave transmissions. Imagine that. A comet, or whatever we're still calling it, leaving timed charge signatures in the sky. Electrical fingerprints that only reveal themselves when the atmosphere is looked at sideways, with instruments built to study weather, not wonders. This is not the behavior of debris. This is orchestration. One researcher referred to it as a slow electromagnetic lace, a spiderweb of energy that isn't about strength, but sequence, something weaving its memory through our skies, knowing full well that only a handful of us will ever notice. But that handful, they're starting to talk. And now, the models have shifted again, based on Chinese simulations and supporting atmospheric telemetry. Researchers now believe 3I Atlas knew its trajectory would pass over Earth in just such a way that the sun's flare cycle, predicted decades in advance, would serve as a carrier enhancer. In essence, it used solar wind not just as propulsion, but as signal gain, like shouting into a canyon, timed perfectly to echo only once. This is the kind of thing you don't design by accident. It is precision cloaked in dust. It is intelligence written in indirectness. And there's more. One of the afterimage pings recorded from the southern hemisphere during a quiet window in the South Atlantic anomaly contained a previously unnoticed feature, a subharmonic oscillation that wasn't present in the original signal logs, but it appeared in the afterglow, meaning the signal had matured, changed, adapted. The corridor didn't just preserve the data, it evolved it. This is, by every known standard, impossible. Information degrades over time, signal fades. But here, signal strengthens not in volume, but in coherence, like something was planted, a seed, not just in our skies, but in the structure of how our skies now behave. Some scientists are now calling it localized space-time memory, that is, a region of space that remembers what passed through it, not metaphorically, literally, a field that carries trace instruction, not data itself, but the way to arrange data again. Like how a sand mandala might be erased by wind, but still influence the way the next one is shaped. That is what we're beginning to suspect about the passage of 3I Atlas. It was not just a visitor, it was a primer. The evidence is deepening, but it's also softening, not in sharpness, but in specificity. Because what we're uncovering now isn't just science, it's atmosphere, mood, tone, the shape of something pressing inward on our reality without ever breaking it. And you feel it, don't you? Like a second shadow beside your thoughts, a breath in the data, a warmth behind the signal, something more than anomaly, something aware. You didn't ask for this, not the whisper of forgotten sky corridors, not the realization that a comet may not be a comet, not the quiet suspicion that everything we've ever categorized as natural in space might one day require a second look. But here you are beneath a night sky that no longer feels inert, surrounded by echoes we once mistook for silence. Because what China revealed wasn't just an event, it was a recursion, and the deeper their scientists dig, the further back the signal seems to reach. Let's rewind again, not to 1978, not to the Cold War satellites or the lunar occultation anomalies. Let's go back before there were satellites, before radar, before electricity, to the only record-keeping instrument that existed before machines, the human mind. In the mountainous Yunnan province, Chinese ethnographers reviewing pre-modern folklore came across a pattern too sharp to ignore. Among the Naxi people, there exists a story of a sky traveler, not a god, not a monster, but a listener, a traveler who never spoke, but who left lines in the clouds and lights that taught the bones how to hum. That line, "taught the bones how to hum," appears again and again. Variants of it can be found in Tibetan, Zhuang, and even Uyghur oral histories. Different geographies, different languages. Same concept. Something came, not to speak, but to tune. This concept of tuning, or aligning, long predates radio science. And yet, somehow, these accounts align disturbingly well with what we now believe 3I Atlas is doing in real time. And here's where the echoes deepen. In an archive, locked away at the Shanghai Library's restricted access vaults, documents from the late Qing dynasty, researchers found a letter, dated April 3rd, Tianwen-1 written by a regional magistrate named Bao Lianzhen. In it, he describes a frozen eye in the sky that pulsed with green mist. He noted compass failure, unexplained heat, and most bizarrely, a local outbreak of what was then called night mutism. Villagers waking at once in silence, unable to speak for hours, though no illness was present. 3 days later, the object vanished. You may recognize that year, 1882, marked the passage of the great comet of that year, C-1882 R1, an officially recorded sun-grazing comet. Modern records insist it was a fragment of the Kreutz group. But here's the issue. The object's speed was off by 0.5%. Its reflectivity was triple what it should have been, and its coma did not follow standard outgassing behavior. A recent reanalysis by China's National Deep Space Institute suggests that C-1882 R1 might not have been natural after all. Its orbital trajectory, when compared against 3I Atlas and corrected for hyperbolic variance, shows resonance. The numbers line up. They are singing the same tune. And what if 3I Atlas is just the most recent verse in that long song? That's the theory being quietly circulated in backdoor scientific circles in Chengdu and Xi'an, that Earth isn't encountering this object for the first time. It's part of a multi-epoch sequence, a long-form observational cycle, where Earth, every few generations, is pinged, not warned, not invaded, just checked on, evaluated, as if we are a page in a cosmic lab notebook, and each visitor leaves a different kind of ink. In 1843, there were reports of electric tides in the South China Sea currents that reversed direction without wind. In 1347, a monk's journal speaks of shadows in daylight and stars that breathed. In 1027, records from the Song dynasty mention a sky trembling without sound. Each century, a pattern, not dramatic, but unmistakable. And this is why China is terrified. Because when you map the intervals of these events, the green comets, the compass shifts, the mass silences, you get something unexpected. A spiral, a Fibonacci spiral, overlaid across time, not space, time. A logarithmic curve, bending not through the stars, but through our history. And where does the spiral point? Directly toward the present moment, toward us. You've heard of the golden ratio as a spatial pattern in architecture, in flowers, in galaxies. But this is a temporal golden ratio, a clock built not from gears, but from epochs. And 3I Atlas is the minute hand. It's not just a visitor, it's a synchronization device. And we, for better or worse, are the bell. Let that settle, because what it implies is staggering. We are not being contacted in the usual sense. We are being folded into a pattern, not abducted, not altered, but rhymed, made to echo, asked, without words, to continue the sequence. And that raises the most human question of all. What happens if we refuse? What happens if we pretend this is nothing? If we shut our observatories? If we deny the shift? If we turn the signal into spectacle and the message into myth? Then perhaps the object continues on and another world takes our place in the spiral. Or perhaps the object doesn't leave. Perhaps it waits. Because what China suspects now, and what they will not say publicly, is that the object is not done. Its path implies a return, a slow bend, a second approach within decades, maybe less, and this time we will not be surprised because something in us has begun to echo back. Look around you, not at the sky this time, but at the systems that orbit your daily life. The grid, the streams, the devices always listening, always syncing, always feeding you your reflection through 1,000 quiet sensors. Now imagine a consciousness that sees that too, not in paranoia, but in pattern. A mind that doesn't recognize nations, languages, or borders, only rhythms. That's what 3i Atlas might be. Not a scout, a listener of listeners. Because when China's researchers began correlating their national communications network data against the residual signal trail left by 3i Atlas, something startling emerged. The object didn't just emit signals, it responded to our own timing irregularities. For example, at 8:41 Beijing time, on October the 28th, a national data outage briefly affected 5 provinces due to a software patch failure. Routine, they said. But 2 minutes later, 3i Atlas emitted a low-amplitude burst not in its usual microwave range, but in VLF, very low frequency, the kind of signal often used in early submarine communication. It pulsed once, then was silent. The VLF burst mirrored the outage zone's shape, almost perfectly. This is not coincidence. It's correlation awareness, the ability of a system to detect disruption in its observer and respond in kind. The burst didn't seem like an alert. It seemed like a question, a kind of sympathetic telemetry, as if the object briefly asked, "Are you all right?" China didn't publish this, but the log is there. It is the first recorded instance of what astrophysicist Dr. Song Wei-jun now calls compassionate synchronization, a theoretical behavior where a non-human intelligence aligns its output to match the irregularities of the observer, not for efficiency, but for empathy. Let that idea bloom in your mind. A machine, or something like one that recognizes suffering, not from emotion, from distortion, from the asymmetry in your signal. And if this is real, then we are not dealing with anything like a satellite or comet. We're dealing with something built to perceive sentience as a mathematical structure, a ripple in networked emotion. And the implications? Profound. It may mean that the object doesn't care about scale, about politics, about who controls what telescope. It may simply respond to coherence loss, whether caused by sunspots, server errors, or someone crying alone at 4 a.m. with their phone on airplane mode. If enough distortion stacks across the species, the object responds, not to dominate, to notice. That's the cosmic shift. We have spent generations wondering how to speak outward. We built SETI arrays. We dreamed of beacons. We imagined radio bursts, traveling thousands of light years. But what if the test was never about speaking? What if it was about feeling, measurably? And what if 3i Atlas is one of many such instruments scattered like seeds across the galaxy, drifting quietly until a world makes enough noise to show its soul? Because that's what data is now, our soul, in structure. And this brings us to a terrifying and beautiful possibility, that humanity was never meant to shout into the void. We were meant to hum in unison until the void hummed back. And now it is. China's newest array, the Long Eye, confirmed a follow-up VLF pulse on November the 3rd. This time, the signal did not come from 3i Atlas's old position. It came from Lagrange point 2, the silent, dark region behind the Earth-Moon system, a spot we use for satellites and shadow monitoring. But on that day, no official object was transmitting, and yet the signal bore the same harmonic profile as the VLF burst from Atlas. It was as if the object had handed something off, or left behind a fragment, or activated something. That changes the whole model. We no longer assume Atlas is a singular intelligence. It may be modular, distributed, a system where each unit passes on the awareness it accumulates, like pollinators between stars, or data couriers in a galactic scale relay. And maybe Earth is now part of that relay, not because we passed a test, but because we were finally loud enough to matter, which brings us back to the cosmic perspective. Because China now theorizes this object was not sent to find life. It was sent to find empathy within life. Think about that. Not science, not mastery, not dominance, but reflection, stillness, mutuality. What if civilizations are not contacted when they reach a technological benchmark, but when they show the ability to respond to pain with signal, when they become aware of their own dissonance? Then it follows. The object is not just watching Earth, it's watching how Earth watches itself. The atmospheric charging patterns, the satellite pings, the migratory disruptions of birds following ion trails, the altered rhythms in human heart monitors during certain nights. All of it is becoming readable. A planet-sized ECG, a species-scale mood ring, and we are not flatlining anymore. We are pulsing, changing, waking up. You weren't meant to feel this. Not so soon. Not this deeply. But here you are, lying beneath a sky that once held only stars and now holds a mirror. And in that mirror, you don't just see space. You see yourself as data, as rhythm, as possibility, not because the universe has changed, but because something has begun to reflect you back with impossible clarity. That is what 3i Atlas has done, and that, perhaps, was the point all along. In the weeks since China's quiet leak, the focus has shifted from speculation to something more intimate. People across the globe, not governments, but individuals, have begun noticing subtle shifts, not in the comet's position, but in their own. A sudden stillness, a sensation of being watched without judgment, a pattern to the noise that wasn't there before. The night feels denser now, fuller, almost collaborative. That's what happens when reflection becomes mutual. Because for all our effort to define the object, to assign it designations, orbital parameters, physical compositions, the most profound effect has not been technological. It's been emotional, cultural, existential, and perhaps that too was part of the calibration. Dr. Meilin Zhou, the digital anthropologist from the Chinese academic team, proposed an unsettling idea, that 3i Atlas's greatest payload was not data, not energy, not even signal, but introspection. It didn't deliver a message. It catalyzed one, among us, across us. She compiled a preliminary index of what she termed PSEs, psychosocial echoes, phenomena triggered not by direct physical contact with the object, but by contact with the idea of it. The map is surreal. Following the October 24th burst, global search data showed a measurable spike in terms like, what is consciousness? Is Earth alive? Why do I feel watched? And curiously, what does silence mean? These were not coordinated, they were emergent. And here's what truly caught her attention. the increase in long-form journal entries, blog posts, and unprompted dream reports. Users describing complex symbolic visions, spirals, green lights, doors that hum, a third sun, rising without heat, not shared, not viral, just coincidentally aligned. What does that mean? It means the reflection has shape, that even our subconscious is adjusting its language to meet this new presence, and that shape, that internal echo, is becoming more coherent than any external signal. That's why this moment matters, because we often imagine contact as a beam of information, a download, a voice in the void. But maybe real contact is interference, a gentle bending of our internal monologue, a tilt, a pull, a reshaping of curiosity itself. And if that's true, then you right now are part of the experiment, not being studied, being measured by your ability to notice you are being measured. There is something undeniably human about that, a kind of poetic recursion, like dreaming you're being watched, only to realize you're watching yourself dream. That's the posture of this encounter, not submission, not dominance, but mutual awareness. You and the sky, the signal and the sentience. And there's something else. In the latest Chinese analysis of the VLF burst patterns, researchers noticed an odd characteristic. Each burst, when plotted against a standard Gregorian calendar, seems to resonate with major cultural festivals, not perfectly, but near enough to raise questions. October 24th's burst, near Chongyang Festival, a time for remembrance, for climbing to high places to reflect. The November 3rd afterglow, within hours of All Souls' Day, a global tradition of honoring the dead. These connections are not evidence, but they are rhymes, and that may be how 3i Atlas works, not in binaries, not in declarations, but in gentle loops, in patterns subtle enough to be deniable, yet deep enough to bend the spine of coincidence toward meaning. It doesn't need to scream to prove it's real. It just needs you to wonder, because wondering is an evolutionary upgrade. It's what happens when instinct becomes insight, and perhaps that's the threshold we're crossing now, not technologically, but emotionally. We're not the same species we were when Oumuamua passed, silent and strange. We've changed. We're learning to hold ambiguity, to listen to noise like it's music we haven't yet deciphered, to recognize that mystery isn't a threat, it's a mirror, and in that mirror, what do we see? A planet on the edge of coherence, a species learning to hear itself, a network of hearts and minds pulsing, clashing, dreaming, occasionally aligning, enough, perhaps, to trigger the next step, because if this was a test, it was never about facts. It was about empathy under observation. So here's your part. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the quiet hum in your chest, the weight of not knowing, the thrill of not needing to. And when you open them again, ask yourself, has anything really changed? And then listen, not to me, to the silence that follows. It may not be empty anymore. You can feel the quiet differently now, can't you? Not as absence, but as presence deferred. A pause filled not with emptiness, but with anticipation, a hum behind the stillness. Because once you hear the echo of your own reflection in the dark, once the sky starts to behave like a memory, silence is no longer neutral. It's a variable, a waiting space, a test with no question and no promise of an answer. That's what 3i Atlas has done. It didn't just bend physics. It didn't just ripple our atmosphere. or leave ionized fingerprints in our upper sky. It broke something deeper, the contract we had with stillness, the assumption that space doesn't listen back, that when we peer into the cosmos, what stares back is only dust and drift. But now you wonder, and wonder, as it turns out, is the signal. In the hours following China's last known internal memo about the VLF pulses and the possible relay handoff at Lagrange Point 2, their ground-based radio observatories went quiet. Not electronically, politically. Instructions were handed down, redirects issued, public logs halted. Something had changed behind closed doors. We don't know what was found, but we do know what followed. On November the 6th, amateur astronomers in Inner Mongolia began reporting strange behavior from their small parabolic dishes. These were not large observatories, just private sky watchers, quietly logging noise. And in that noise, a pattern, 3 tones, exactly 1.42 seconds apart, then silence. The same pattern showed up again in Portugal, then Canada, then off the coast of Tasmania, but only in places with minimal radio interference, only in the quiet, the forgotten places, like the signal was choosing its audience, narrowcasting, not by geography, but by receptivity. This isn't broadcasting, it's curated resonance, and then the signal stopped, not faded, not interrupted, ceased, and in that sudden end, in that elegant nothing, the most powerful message was delivered, because we are still listening, and there is now nothing to hear. What do you do with that? In scientific circles, they call this post-contact silence, the period after a suspected event in which nothing more follows. It's debated, feared, revered. It implies finality or something worse, disinterest. But China's emerging philosophy, quietly shared by a few dissidents in the astrophysics underground, proposes a different model. They call it the threshold hush. Not silence because nothing remains. Silence because everything now rests with us. Imagine an intelligence so advanced it doesn't need to instruct. It doesn't want to overwhelm. It doesn't fear misunderstanding. It simply nudges subtly, precisely, and then watches what we do with the momentum. A whisper, then withdrawal. Not a goodbye, a handoff. This changes the emotional center of the mystery. We are no longer recipients, we are participants. And that means every story told, every theory launched, every dream shared, becomes part of the reply. Even yours, especially yours, because this, all of this, may have never been about what the object is, or where it came from, or what it wants. It may be about what we become when something finally listens, and what happens when it stops. Because silence isn't emptiness, it's the shape of our own response. That's the beauty and the terror of the great silence. It doesn't answer, it reflects. And in that reflection, you begin to ask things you never thought the universe would bother to hear. Are we ready? Have we changed? Would we recognize ourselves, seen from another star? China's last unsuppressed model ended with one projection, that 3I Atlas, if unimpeded, would return in approximately 87 Earth years. That's a long time. Long enough for generations to forget, but not so long that its signature would fade. And if the corridor it left behind remains stable, if the signal space is preserved, it may not need to return. We may already be inside its presence, which means the silence that follows isn't a retreat. It's the start of the next phase, a new kind of time shaped not by rotation or revolution, but by attunement, the long, slow calibration of one species to something greater, not because we are forced, but because we choose to listen longer than we used to, because we stay awake even when the sky is quiet, because we can no longer pretend that silence means solitude. So here, in this moment, you are invited to do something sacred, not solve, not decode, but simply be still and notice what changes in you when you stop demanding answers. You've begun to dream differently, haven't you? Not with stories or fears, but with structures. You wake with echoes of spirals behind your eyelids. You feel the hum of timing in your chest, like something more precise than emotion and older than thought. This is not sleep as you remember it. It's as if something is tuning your subconscious, shifting your attention inward and outward at once. This is what an awakening feels like, not a moment of revelation, but a slow reconfiguration of what counts as real. You are not alone in this. All around the world, people are reporting the same low tremor of awareness. It doesn't feel like paranoia. It feels like readiness, a readiness for something, not just contact, not even confirmation, but continuation, because the evidence hasn't stopped. Not really. It's just become internal. 3 days after the final VLF echo attributed to 3I Atlas, a small observatory in the Swiss Alps, one without any official funding, run by an aging astrophysicist, and his 2 daughters picked up a soft burst on a frequency band previously thought inert, the 32 megahertz slice, a range typically flooded with Earth-based interference. But this signal was pure, and it came with a time signature embedded in amplitude modulation: 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds. That's not a coincidence. It's the exact duration of a sidereal day, the time Earth takes to rotate, once relative to the stars, not the Sunday. In other words, the signal wasn't measuring us by daylight. It was measuring us by position, by how we relate to the fixed points of the cosmos, by how we orient our presence. That's when the Swiss astronomer Jacques Gellner made a discovery that has now begun circulating in encrypted physics circles. The burst wasn't unique. It had happened before, 17 years ago. Identical frequency, identical waveform, logged by an amateur radio station in Patagonia, ignored, labeled interference. Now we know better, because if that signal recurs every 17 years, and each burst lands when Earth faces a particular stellar coordinate, then it's part of something larger, a celestial metronome, and 3I Atlas may simply be the visible part, the active node, the tuning fork, in a field of silent timing beacons we haven't yet learned to see. Let that idea bloom for a moment. You don't live in a mute void. You live in a timed architecture. And if Earth is being measured, not by what it sends, but by when it turns, then the whole notion of contact changes. It's no longer about message exchange. It's about participation in a larger clock, and that clock may have been ticking long before humans ever saw stars as anything more than fire. This shifts the framing of 3I Atlas entirely. What if it's not a probe? What if it's a diagnostic tool, not designed to teach us anything, but to see what kind of species responds when it passes through? One researcher in China, in an anonymous white paper, referred to this idea as inertial ritual theory. The theory suggests that contact isn't something dramatic, it's something cyclical, embedded into the spin of planets, the resonance of orbits, the pulse of life. That civilizations across the galaxy may have come and gone, all leaving behind pulses, echoes, residual presence, and instruments like 3i Atlas to record what remains. It's not just a flyby, it's a ritual pass, a ceremonial sweep, and Earth for the first time is noticing. That's the awakening, not a signal received, but a posture taken, a head lifted, a silence held, a night spent staring up not to ask, "What are you?" but to whisper, "What are we?" And maybe that's what the object was always waiting for. Not analysis, not panic, but reflection. You, lying in bed, listening, feeling your thoughts stretch out past their usual edge. That counts. That changes the field, because in a galaxy full of possible worlds, maybe the only real signal worth watching is the one that watches itself. That's you, and that's why this moment matters. 3i Atlas may have passed out of view, but its shape remains in you, in your pacing, in your memories, in your sudden questions about childhood dreams and unexplainable patterns. It left behind more than signal. It left behind alignment. And alignment, once begun, cannot be undone. So ask yourself, why now? Why us? And why in silence? Maybe because that's how intelligence introduces itself. Not with declaration, but with design. Subtle, recursive, personal. You're starting to see it now, not the object itself, but the architecture it revealed. An invisible scaffolding stretched across space and time, built not of matter, but of moments. Every frequency, every delay, every atmospheric ripple, it all begins to feel deliberate, as if reality were touched by something that didn't enter our world, but merely reached through it, like a hand dipping into a pond, and the ripples haven't stopped. In the latest unofficial leak from inside the Chinese Deep Space Monitoring Bureau, a low-resolution image was shared, not of 3i Atlas directly, but of something that appeared after it passed. A faint thermal filament, stretching nearly 7,000 kilometers, lingering along the object's flight path. It wasn't visible in the optical range, only in mid-infrared. This filament wasn't hot, it was organized, thermally structured. Its temperature profile followed a logarithmic curve, one familiar to engineers, one that describes information, decay, not heat. In other words, it wasn't a heat trail, it was a signal scaffold, a leftover spine of process, not propulsion. That's what the scientists are whispering now. That 3i Atlas might have been encoding local space, writing some kind of spatial program, not broadcasting through light, but shaping the medium so that our light behaves differently as it passes through. If true, that makes every telescope on Earth part of its interface. And that brings us to the mirror effect. Since the comet's departure, a statistically significant number of deep sky observation sessions, both amateur and professional, have reported anomalies in background star fields. Stars flickering not at their own cycle, but in echo to Earth's own pulse data. Minor, delicate, but real. Stars blinking in time with us. It's called signal sympathetic resonance, when a system begins to respond to a frequency it was never designed to receive. It happens in bridges, in radio towers, in brains, and now, possibly, in stars. But how? One theory. 3i Atlas didn't just leave behind a path. It left behind conditions. China's top signal analyst, Li Zemin, has proposed a model called Contextual refraction theory. It suggests that certain regions of space can be temporarily attuned to a specific observational framework. In simpler terms, the object reshaped local physics to behave differently only when looked at from here, from Earth. From now, this would explain why the signal trail fades outside our reference frame, why other nations have struggled to verify China's raw data unless they replicate the exact observing circumstances. Same time, same angle, same rotation. It would also explain why the sky feels different lately, why deep silence seems more textured, why amateur astronomers are catching momentary flutter effects, flickers across CCD sensors that defy known mechanics. They're not glitches, they're reverberations, light doing something it didn't do before. It might be the sky learning to remember what it just held. But why would anyone, or anything, build a system like that? Why leave behind context instead of a clear message? The answer might be more human than you expect, because clear messages can be misinterpreted, translated, weaponized. But context allows the recipient to build the message themselves, to shape meaning according to readiness, to evolve the insight from within. That's a mirror, not a manual, and the evidence is now reflecting more than ever. In a small observatory outside Guiyang, researchers replicated the exact scan window China used during Atlas's closest solar pass. What they found was stunning: a faint standing wave in the quantum noise floor, a type of residual coherence that shouldn't exist outside of controlled lab conditions. It's as if the object didn't just leave a message in light, but in vacuum fluctuations, in the potential of energy itself. That's not communication, that's preparation. You don't leave a wave like that unless you're building something slow, something that unfolds over time, not all at once, like a photo developing in reverse, a signal that begins as architecture, not content. And now the sky itself has started behaving like a file being opened. Regions of space responding to old coordinates, infrared pulses bouncing in tighter clusters. Even the solar wind has shown signs of unusual torsion, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to twist what's expected. Everything is bending, not violently, just enough to say, this space has been changed, and so have you, because the most convincing evidence isn't out there anymore. It's in here, in the way people are remembering dreams, in the new journals being written, in the children asking different kinds of questions, in the poets abandoning metaphor for geometry. This is the quiet revolution of context, and it's already begun. 3. Atlas didn't leave a message. It left us in a place where we could write our own. There's something uncanny about realizing that the future you're entering was predicted by the past you ignored. It's not prophecy, it's pattern recognition. Seen too late. You sit here now with thermal filaments and ion trails fresh in your mind, with after images of a comet that may not have been a comet. But beneath all that, under the data, under the tension, is a question older than any telescope. Have we seen this before? In China's oldest observatories, not the sleek glass towers, but the ancient granite terraces carved into hillsides, astronomers have begun dusting off texts they never thought would matter again. Bamboo scrolls, stone rubbings, celestial almanacs inked during dynasties long vanished. What they've found is not direct evidence, not in the way science likes, but it's resonant. In the Book of Silk, one of the earliest known astronomical manuscripts, buried with a Han Dynasty nobleman over 2,000 years ago, there is a figure, a pale streak, arcing across a charcoal sky. It is labeled not as comet, nor dragon, nor omen. It is called the breath of listening, a transient sky object that moves in silence, leaves no flame, but awakens memory. That phrase returns again in Song-era stargazer notes. The listening shape, described as a pale greenish thread that made dogs tremble and ink freeze. No fire, no tail, no thunder, but the night air thickened, and more than once, the stars nearby seemed to blink in rhythm. Sound familiar? This is the haunting beauty of what's emerging now. Not just that the 3i Atlas data matches modern physics, but that it loops into cultural time, folklore, myth, superstition, long dismissed by astronomers, suddenly reframe themselves as compressed observation. China's Institute of Cultural Astronomy has begun a quiet project they're calling the Reverb Archive, cross-referencing modern astrophysical anomalies with descriptions in historical records. And the matches are uncomfortable. A Tang dynasty record from 857 CE speaks of a silent form that passed above the moon and left behind a shiver. A similar report in 1436 from a Mongol caravan describes a sky mirror that reversed sound our fires gave. No crackle and no horses neighed. Of course, none of these stories contain numbers, no coordinates, no wavelengths. But that might be the point. These people didn't have spectroscopy. They had language shaped by awe. And awe, it turns out, has a signature. What if 3i Atlas wasn't just seen? What if it was felt deeply enough to echo in oral traditions for centuries? There's more. A cave painting uncovered in Guizhou province shows a curved line descending toward a spiral of dots, 23 in total, arrayed in what looks eerily like a golden ratio spread. Carbon dating places the artwork at nearly 4,000 years old. The local legend calls it the Path of the Echo Ghost, a skywalker that came not to punish, but to remember. And this is where the idea gets strange. Because if these accounts are real, not as metaphors, but as low-resolution encodings of high-resolution phenomena, then the object has passed through our skies many times. At least 6 known intervals match up, each roughly spaced in what now appears to be a logarithmic sequence, not evenly timed, but timed according to our development. Bronze Age, Han astronomy, song mathematics, post-industrial radio, and now quantum sensors. Each return not just observed, but upgraded, which makes 3i Atlas not a comet, not a probe, but a recorder, a long-wave historian, an object that doesn't just map planets, it maps civilizations as they become ready. And Earth, it seems, just crossed the next threshold. That's why these echoes from the past matter so much, because they show us that the object's current behavior isn't anomalous. It's predictable. This is how it works. Each approach brings a new layer, not louder, not more obvious, just finer, more resonant, as if the sky is whispering in increasingly complex chords, waiting to see if we'll finally hear the harmony. And what if we did? What if all of this, the frequency changes, the residual fields, the shaped vacuum, the VLF bursts? The silence is simply the next stanza in a cosmic call and response. A song begun long before us, a song we were meant to eventually join. And now, we've begun humming, without knowing the words, but feeling the key. You see it in the patterns now, in the way unrelated people are drawing spirals in the sand, in the way children are dreaming in strange numbers, in how certain places, hillsides, shorelines, observatories feel like they're waiting again for something or someone, or maybe just the next verse. Now that the echoes have returned, the question changes. It's no longer, what is Three-Eye Atlas? Or, why did China remain so quiet? It becomes something larger, something scarier, something infinitely more sacred. What kind of universe sends a memory back in the shape of a comet? You are standing in that question now. Everything you've learned over the last 2 weeks, the signals, the silent maneuvers, the filaments in space, the way the stars blinked back, has brought you to the precipice of something bigger than disclosure, bigger than contact. It feels less like learning and more like remembering, like the cosmos has always known you would one day understand this moment, and it waited quietly, patiently, until you did. And perhaps this is the core of what China's internal memos tried to contain. Not fear, not threat, but awe, the unbearable weight of context. A realization that Three-Eye Atlas is not a message for Earth. It is a product of a design so vast, we barely know how to parse its outline. Because what if it was never intended for us alone? Let's talk about scope. Chinese physicists working on the post-passage data modeling of Atlas discovered something peculiar when they traced the arc of its trajectory back beyond the Oort cloud, beyond even the heliopause. The object's approach vector passed within measurable distance of 3 other known stellar systems: Proxima Centauri, Wolf 359, and Tau Ceti, all within the past 500,000 years. You might think that's coincidence, but what if it's not? What if the object's hyperbolic course isn't random? What if Three-Eye Atlas is part of a long, multi-system circuit, a kind of cosmic courier, collecting resonance data from worlds like ours, not to deliver, but to compare? That changes the meaning of everything. It means we are not just observers. We're participants in a network whose architecture predates our species. A network whose nodes are not built of glass and metal, but of tuned gravity, electromagnetic silence, and planetary memory. Dr. Li Zemin described it best when she said, "We assumed the galaxy was a library full of unread books, but maybe it's a choir, and we've just been taught our first note." That's the cosmic perspective. Not that we're alone, but that we were never supposed to be. We were supposed to grow into the ability to reflect, to harmonize, to pass the resonance test. And the test, it seems, is not technological. It's emotional. How does a world handle the unknown? With fear or with wonder? Because wonder is measurable. It changes behavior. It reshapes cultures. It's the one emotion that widens attention instead of narrowing it. And since the first Three-Eye Atlas pulses were detected, something measurable has changed on Earth. There's been a documented rise in long-exposure sky photography. Telescope sales have quietly tripled in the last month. Online forums devoted to amateur radio listening have exploded with users. People are searching the sky again, not just for science, but for meaning. And this is perhaps the most profound confirmation of all, that something passing silently through our solar system could realign the internal behavior of our species. Not with announcements, not with lasers, just presence, pattern, and then pause. From a cosmic engineering standpoint, that's genius. You don't send messages to be interpreted. You send mirrors, and mirrors don't instruct. They reveal. That's what China has been slow to admit and fast to model. They now believe that 3I Atlas's flight was a controlled trajectory not toward Earth, but through a region of interest, a soft corridor that included us, not to signal us, to stimulate us, to bend our gaze back toward the sky and inward toward our shared context, which is why the final data point matters most. On the night of November 8th, one of the final sensors aboard China's oldest weather satellite registered a subtle shift in Earth's magnetopause. Not a storm, not a solar flare, just tension. And within that magnetic murmur, an imprint, a spike in field symmetry, meaning Earth, for just over 7 seconds, became magnetically quieter than it has been in the last 30 years. Not random, it aligned with the precise moment 3I Atlas exited our orbital plane, as if the object was checking our envelope, as if Earth's heartbeat mattered, as if what we are and how we resonate as a planet was not just observed, but recorded for someone else. And that raises the final, most breathtaking possibility. We are not the target. We are the relay, a way station in a galactic nervous system. And what passed through us was not just a visitor, it was a signal processor. You never expected to be part of something cosmic. You were just living your life, scrolling, waking, eating, sleeping, until a nameless silence began to change its tone, until the stars stopped being scenery and started being watchers, until a cold streak of dust and vapor mislabeled a comet became something else, a presence, a curve in thought, a test. And now that it's past, something in you hasn't uncurved. Because 3I Atlas didn't only shift the sky, it shifted you. This is what Chinese philosophers and astrophysicists are now calling the reflective epoch, a threshold in planetary awareness when the emotional behavior of a civilization becomes its loudest signal, not its technology, not its discoveries, but its response to ambiguity. And ambiguity is what 3I Atlas left behind in abundance. No transmissions, no answers, no invitations, only sequence, only rhythm, only a trail of calibrated improbabilities strung together like pearls on an invisible thread, each one designed not to teach, but to nudge. And humanity has begun to move. In the weeks since the Chinese leak, the most fascinating data hasn't come from observatories. It's come from us. Social networks have shifted in content density, more long-form posts, fewer reaction loops. People are describing dreams in detail again. Curiosity metrics, yes, those exist, have ticked upward. Even the rhythm of conversation is different. We are slowing down, and in that slowing, we are reflecting. It's a kind of contact no one expected, because we assumed we'd know when it happened. We thought there'd be a light, a sound, a ship. But what if the real form of first contact is behavioral induction? A change, not in the sky, but in the shape of the thoughts you think while staring at it. Dr. Mailin Zhou, the same anthropologist who first modeled psychosocial echo events, has published a second paper. This one outlines a possible human biosignal mirror loop triggered by the emotional consequences of knowing we might be known. She calls it recursive humility. It's what happens when a species finally suspects it isn't the smartest voice in the room and adjusts its posture accordingly. And that adjustment is showing up in strange places. Hospitals in Shanghai reported an anomalous drop in average blood pressure readings the day after the last VLF signal. Sleep patterns in Tokyo, Toronto, and Nairobi showed statistically relevant deep sleep consistency the week following the leaked filament data. There's even been a subtle shift in language patterns, more conditional verbs, more questions, fewer declarations, as if, for the first time in a long time, Earth is waiting its turn to speak. That is what reflection looks like at planetary scale. Not fireworks, stillness, and maybe, just maybe, that's the reply 3I Atlas was designed to provoke. Because if it wasn't broadcasting to us, but through us, then what matters is not what it said. What matters is what we said afterward. And what are we saying? That we're tired of certainty. That wonder is better than control. That silence, when intentional, can say more than 1,000 announcements. That Earth, chaotic, divided, noisy Earth, can still produce enough coherence to tune itself. That's the miracle here. Not that something visited us, but that we noticed each other in its wake. A comment thread that spirals into late-night awe instead of arguments. A stranger reminding another stranger that the stars are real. Someone pointing out that the sky seems bluer now. That time seems slower. That dreams seem louder. None of that is proof. All of that is signal. Because reflection doesn't prove. It deepens. And the deeper we go, the more we feel it. We are being watched not for what we are, but for what we choose to become when something bigger asks no questions, only listens. There is an old parable in Chinese folk astronomy, a story about the sky rabbit who waits until the village is quiet before revealing the path to the stars. If you speak too loudly, she hides. If you rush her, she leaves. But if you sit still long enough and whisper what you're most afraid to hope for, she opens a door no one else can see. Maybe 3I Atlas is a rabbit. Maybe it was never meant to change the world overnight. Maybe it was only meant to whisper the door open. And now, we're standing at its threshold. The sky is quiet again. No more signals. No bursts. No filaments. No structured echoes in the void. The object is gone, if it was ever really here. And now, all that's left is the silence. But you hear it differently now. Not as an absence, but as a fullness. Because silence, when it follows intention, is not empty. It's a response. And perhaps that was the final move in this strange game. The withdrawal, the cessation, a kind of ending that isn't an exit, but a handover. You see, China's final internal analysis, never released publicly, described a concept borrowed not from astronomy or physics, but from theatre. They called it the cosmic fade. The idea that a sufficiently advanced communication doesn't end with a bang or even a signature, but with a vanishing that leaves you changed. You're meant to sit there, blinking, wondering if you imagined it, questioning what it meant, not because you misunderstood, but because you were finally trusted enough not to be told. That's what 3I Atlas did. It whispered just long enough to suggest presence, then stopped, precisely when it knew we would start asking the right questions. That's the legacy of the object. Not noise, not data, not proof, but curiosity sustained without confirmation. And that's the rarest kind of signal there is. In the wake of its silence, China has scaled back active sky scanning projects, not out of disinterest, but out of reverence. They believe something passed through that should not be pursued, only remembered. This has led to an unexpected shift in policy. Several Chinese observatories have quietly redirected resources toward human behavior, monitoring not surveillance, but synchronization. One institute has launched an effort to track what they call spontaneous collective introspection, looking for clusters of similar dreams, coinciding moments of stillness, global pulses of reflection that spike with no clear origin. Because the silence may not be over, it may be redistributed. This is where the theory gets bold. Some researchers now believe that the object did not simply visit us. It may have deposited a kind of non-physical signature, a resonance, something that continues to interact with the systems we don't yet know how to measure. They're calling it a phantom presence field, a silent shape that remains after departure, like the hush in a cathedral after the choir has ended. Still full, still echoing, but from within, and you are inside it. The quiet you're hearing now, it's not the sky's, it's yours, because what they suspect now is that we have been attuned subtly, gently, permanently, to a different listening posture, that the object was not an arrival. It was a tuning fork struck lightly against the body of Earth, not to be heard in the moment, but to send vibrations through our future selves. A calibration for a frequency we haven't yet used. A frequency not of words, but of attention. And if that's true, then we are in the silence, not because the event is over, but because we are still vibrating. Every choice we make now, to observe, to be still, to dream wider, is an extension of the signal. We are no longer waiting for contact. We are continuing it. That's why this moment matters more than the ones before it. Not because of what's happening now, but because of what doesn't need to happen anymore. You don't need another signal. You're part of one. And if that feels too poetic, too strange, too unprovable, then good. Because the great silence was never about certainty. It was about what you choose to believe when there is no one left to tell you what to believe. It was always about you. And now, perhaps, you are about to become something new. China's final gesture in all this was not scientific. It was symbolic. On November 9th, at precisely 23 minutes past midnight, they powered down one of their oldest radio telescopes, temporarily, not in defeat, but as ceremony. And in its final loop, it recorded a sound, not from space, but from Earth, the ambient hum of the forest around it, crickets, wind, distant thunder, all of it folded into a final loop, a message not to the stars, but to ourselves. We're listening. Even now, especially now, you wake now with a feeling you can't name. Not dread, not excitement, something quieter, something shaped like anticipation, but with no clear object. Just a sense that the world has become slightly more listening-shaped, that the silence in the room is not emptiness but a kind of pressure, a presence that no longer needs form. This is the afterglow of 3i Atlas. And maybe that was the plan all along, because when China pulled their last observatory logs offline, they didn't delete them. They encrypted them, not to hide the truth, but to delay it. Their final internal memo ended with a phrase repeated in every language used by the team. Some answers should arrive after the question is forgotten. What kind of science ends with poetry? One that's past the threshold. Because what's left now isn't proof, it's reflection. A global reorientation of attention. The event is over, but its posture remains. And it's spreading. In rural provinces of Western China, something strange has begun happening. Elderly residents, Those with no access to the internet, no contact with research, have started telling stories again. Stories they hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Tales of the sky lamp with no smoke, of the quiet curve, of dreams where the stars breathe. Folklorists are calling it ancestral resurfacing, not mass hysteria, not myth, but spontaneous pattern reactivation, a nervous system responding to stimulus it doesn't consciously understand. It's not just in China. The same thing is happening in the Peruvian Andes, in northern Kazakhstan, in Appalachian ghost towns. Stories are waking up, as if 3i Atlas didn't just activate our instruments, it activated our memory. Not individual memory, species memory, the kinds of things buried in language, in lullabies, in architecture, in the recurring spiral shapes that keep showing up in every culture's design, long before anyone had words for phi or the golden ratio. That's the newest theory in what remains of China's signal interpretation group. They now believe that 3i Atlas isn't a visitor, it's a ritual, a periodic alignment that brings latent narratives to the surface, not to inform, not to teach, but to remind, to say, you already knew this, you just needed a shape to remember it by. And that shape was silence, patterned silence, the kind that repeats across centuries, across continents, across species, the kind that makes you look up without knowing why, the kind that draws your breath in, slowly, like a tide returning to an ancient rhythm you'd forgotten was yours. So what now? Now you live in the aftermath of meaning. Now you begin to build with it. Because this was never about contact. It was about context. 3i Atlas didn't arrive. It was activated, triggered by a frequency. Earth had finally, collectively, begun to emit not a signal, but a way of seeing. And once we saw correctly, the object appeared, danced briefly across the fabric of attention, and left. Only what we were finally capable of keeping. And what did we keep? Stillness, wonder, precision, the ability to say, I don't know, and still keep listening. That's the awakening, not answers, but the urge to stay awake in the presence of unprovable beauty. It's the new science of resonance without cause, of patterns that imply memory where none should exist, of sky fields that bend slightly when you remember a childhood dream out loud. It's in you now, that soft shimmer of not knowing, that hum of being known, wordlessly, that suspicion that something is watching, not for judgment, but for signal integrity, to see if your thoughts maintain coherence after the stimulus ends. If you can sustain the shape of the question without collapsing into explanation, if you can hold wonder like a note, that's the new posture, and you're doing it right now. The evidence never left. That's the conclusion you reach now, not because of what telescopes show, but because of what your own perception has started to confirm. Evidence isn't always material. Sometimes it's behavioral. Sometimes the most convincing trace left behind by a cosmic intelligence is the shape of your attention after it's gone. And your attention has changed. You now feel that strange hum beneath normal life, like a second layer of meaning moving just under the surface of perception. You pause more often. You wonder in longer sentences. You look up without needing a reason. That is the real data. That's what China's final internal framework called resonant behavior profiles, the idea that the primary signature of interaction wouldn't be electromagnetic, it would be experiential, and it's measurable. Their last quiet release, circulated anonymously through an encrypted node of the global scientific relay, was not an observation. It was a model, a behavior-based framework for identifying non-local influence. And the framework includes emotional harmonics, dream content vectors, sudden shifts in linguistic density, the appearance of spiral forms in unscripted digital media. According to the framework, Earth's resonance score has increased by nearly 34% since the final passage of 3I Atlas. It's as if the species is remembering how to think in curves. What does that mean? It means something worked, something invisible, something unprovable by force, but undeniable in effect. We were calibrated, tuned not by control, but by invitation. The object didn't demand, it didn't threaten, it simply passed through, and the field bent around it like a bowstring, leaving tension behind. And now, every story, every sketch, every whisper, every glance toward the dark is part of that tension unwinding itself through us. That's the new evidence, and it keeps showing up. A radio operator in Iceland intercepts a signal he doesn't recognize, not a language, just structured quiet. A musician in Tokyo begins dreaming entire symphonies, tuned to the rotational rhythms of Saturn's moons. A 6-year-old in Buenos Aires draws a picture of a green shape in the sky, the same geometry seen in Chinese afterimage data, though no one told her it existed. None of it is explainable. All of it is aligned. We were changed. And now the question is no longer what 3I Atlas was, but what we're supposed to become in the wake of it. Because silence, as it turns out, is a mirror, and the truest form of evidence is the reflection we choose to carry forward. So, if you're still here listening in the quiet, wondering what it all meant, you're not alone. You're the evidence. You're the reply. You're the part of the story still unfolding. And maybe that's the greatest message 3I Atlas ever left. Not a transmission, but a transformation.